Hello and welcome everyone to the Connecting the Dots webinars by Territorium. My name is Dr. Kiko Suarez, and I'm going to tell you two things about this. One is that I'm super privileged to have our first guest speaker to be someone that I know and I'm very proud of. And also to give you a little bit of a context for Connecting the Dots. So Connecting the Dots was an idea that we had in which we said, well, yes, we are an education technology company, and yes, we have our own software, but the field needs conversations that are agnostic, technology agnostic, solution agnostic, where we give a chance to the experts to express their feelings, their ideas, their concepts about how best we can serve learners in an ecosystem that could be probably better connected. But right now, we still have some work to do. And I'm going to start by saying I'm super, super pumped by this first seminar, or webinar, if you want, because Amber, Dr. Garrison Duncan, is a former colleague when we were both at Lumina Foundation. She built one of the most exciting portfolios that grant makers can dream of in her role as leader in that space, together with other people in that team. And I also told Amber, and I want to tell you all, that she is the mom of the CLR. She invented that word. And eventually she'll tell you how did that happen. But today we're not necessarily talking about comprehensive learner records. In particular, we're talking about an ecosystem. And I just want to show you some kind of rules of engagement, if you want. We are going to let Dr. Garrison Duncan go through a presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then she's going to start sharing her screen. And I will be monitoring the Q&A, but I would encourage you to maybe take note of your questions and then hold until the end, if it is possible. And then just a quick reminder that we already set a couple of other dates. I'll remind you at the end as well, on June 16 and August 8 with also incredible speakers. But for now, what we have is an incredible speaker. And Amber, the floor is yours. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Wonderful. Kiko, that is what a kind introduction. And I have to say, Kiko was on the learning passport bench when we were colleagues at Lumina, and he was on the executive team. And so he planted the big seed that allowed us to launch into this work. So, and thank you, Kiko, for having me and for our continued opportunity to be colleagues and friends. Good afternoon, everyone. I am so thrilled that you chose to spend some time with us today. I'm going to share a couple of slides so we can get into our conversation and really begin to think about, as Kiko mentioned, what's happening in the ecosystem. And what I'm thrilled to be here to share with you is just a bit of understanding of how competencies and competency-based education is being used across many sectors of education to be able to connect learners and provide mobility in ways that we've not been able to before. And so look forward to your questions at the end, but obviously feel free to pop them in the chat as we go so that we can get to them when we open for question and answer time. So I always like to start my conversations about, our work in the why. Why are we really here? What is it that we collectively are trying to do when we're trying to connect dots? And what we're really trying to do with each other and across ecosystems is to make sure that we are able to provide economic mobility for people. And one of the things I like to think about as we're talking about who we're trying to provide that for is to be clear about what we mean by economic mobility. It means that, economically, that my well-being changes over time, that I'm able to increase and my income at a rate that allows me to improve my life. And that is on a continued upward trajectory, that I don't have this nice bump where I maybe get a pay increase, but that pay increase is not enough to sustain me and my family over time. So we really want to all be working towards that mobility over time. And that's where we get the, really focusing in on lifelong learning. These are, not new terms for you, but again, just that our goal is to keep people moving upwardly. And then what we can't lose sight of, and when we're thinking about individuals, is that we have to think about economic mobility at scale, that when it's really scaled to everyone in a population of learners, this is when we start to really get at and drive towards greater equity and justice in our society, and making sure that not just one person from one population of people is achieving that economic mobility, but again, everyone's having equal access to and equity from our systems to be able to have that upward mobility. And so, the example given here is thinking about how this impacts certain neighborhoods or cities or states, and how, due to, certainly historical policy decisions, a history of discrimination in this country, for many reasons, we have some neighborhoods that provide a higher rate of upward mobility just because of those policies, not because of the people that live in them necessarily. So that's where, again, we're trying to dismantle systems that are drastically keeping people from that upward mobility. And so what I find myself in conversation with is lots of folks like you who are saying, how do we do this differently? Again, we want to be making sure that the students and learners that we're working with have that upward mobility. But again, our collective efforts over time are starting to change and make sure we have equal and equitable opportunity across the country and the globe. I know we're probably joined by some folks across the globe. And so I bring this up because we are collectively experiencing, an economic disruption, right? We had COVID-19 hit. We had our labor market was completely, in some ways, halted. And so we had lots of people out of work. During COVID, we had 37 million Americans who were working in industries hit hard by COVID-19, thinking of hospitality, service industries, and that 40 million people then were applying for unemployment and trying to seek some kind of support while they were out of work and couldn't find jobs. When you think about who was working in those jobs, again, due to a history of discrimination and occupational segregation, people of color were disproportionately employed in those industries that were hit hardest. And so you had, again, thinking about economic mobility over time, right? We could start to see the data and see who was hit hardest by that job loss. And then as we look at the unemployment rate, that's quite high, right? Latino unemployment rate was 18.9% at one point during the last 2 years, and Black unemployment was 16.7. And what we have seen, similar to the last recession, is that to re-enter the job market, most of these individuals are going to need a post-high school credential with advanced skills and knowledge. We're seeing that, again, similar to the last recession, the jobs that are coming back are requiring higher levels of skill and knowledge and competency. And so that means our system of learning has to be ready to respond to that. We have to be able to meet those individuals where they're at, get them the credentials they need so that they can have that mobility. But we know, our system doesn't do a good job of providing that type of support and access. And certainly when you disaggregate by race, the credential completion, you can see there's huge gaps. So this is just, again, trying to hit us home. And who are we really trying to serve? And how do we make sure our systems are targeting the right individuals who are most marginalized right now? And this is where just a graph I like to show, which highlights for folks. Again, that last recession hit about 2008. You can see unemployment spike, in particular for Black and Latino individuals in this country. Again, very similar rates to what we just saw from 2008 reproduce here in 2019, 2020. So in a 10-year time span, two big economic recessions. But in the middle, you can see that recovery was not inclusive last time. We pumped lots of federal dollars into programs saying, can we help people get more credentials? We know these jobs, again, coming back are going to require credentials. And you can see unemployment stayed fairly high, above 10% for Black Americans, and then for Latino Americans, it got below 10%, but you can see it was still pretty high. And so a lot of like a double whammy, if you think about adult learners who maybe did not have a credential and are now maybe got a shorter term credential, lost their job in that industry, and now have to go back again. So just something to kind of orient ourselves again of who are we talking about when we are trying to create economic mobility, and just grounding us in the data of what's happening today. So as we think about all those folks who might be able to provide learning and education for the individuals we just discussed, we've done a pretty good job in this country of creating some different pathways for people, right? You've heard about, the top part is my kind of very traditional pathway is that I went to K-12 school. I went, to Cleveland High School, and then I went to Texas Women's University, and then I went to Texas A&M. But what you see listed are lots of different ways that we, if we're in the U.S. context, invest in education and training for people. We have our workforce system that is funded through WIOA, the Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act, where we have apprenticeships. We have things like the Goodwill Excel Center, which is an adult charter high school that's providing learning. We have lots of community centers. So again, training and education providers there. We have new non-traditional types of platforms that are providing learning to people. Boot camps like General Assembly. Then you've got edX. Something that could be on here is Unmuddle is another product. So again, thinking Coursera, right? There's all these new kind of platforms that are emerging where people can go and get access to credentials. Then we have our military that annually trains about 1.2 million people. And does a really good job at it, because you've got to be competent to do your job in the military because people's lives depend on it. So again, we've got lots of folks who are getting trained and educated through that route. And then we know our employers are providing education and training. And so Walmart, for instance, has their Walmart Academy, where they put folks on a manager track, and they go through a very explicit kind of competency-based pathway to demonstrate that they're ready for that role. And then they get, have a graduation ceremony, and that learning is very valuable. And then we also have, in particular, industries who set up certifications and training programs themselves. Thinking about in tech, most obvious, thinking about Microsoft and Google are CompTIA certifications, and then even just your firefighter certification, right, is something that's done through the industry. So again, lots of different ways to learn. And as we think about over a lifetime, what is interesting to think about is that I might engage with several of these types of providers over time to contribute to my full competency set and things that I want and need to be able to use in the labor market to increase my mobility. And so what we have and what you've seen, what we've all done traditionally, is have a very institution-centered approach to learning, where we had very formal types of education, for lack of a better term, like, again, our K-12 system, maybe our universities. But we kind of said that learning happens over here. And then maybe when you go to work, you get some of that education and training. And then maybe you're doing this great service project in your community where you're building competency and fundraising, for instance, or you are managing your life. And maybe you, just getting to and from work and taking care of your 3 kids and your parents. You're doing lots of project management because you've got a lot on your plate. And so people are developing skill sets constantly, but again, we've not been able to really recognize those because we've kind of spaced them out and not treated people as whole beings who are constantly learning and engaging in all of this. And so what you're seeing now is the shift to a learner-centered approach. Again, folks trying to think about, how do we meet individuals where they're at? Well, I need to know, what do they already know? What can they already do? Where have they already engaged in some of these learning opportunities? How can we make sure we're assessing some of that project management skill set that single mother got, because again, she's managing her life in a very significant way. Or maybe again, on the job, there are particular things that I've learned that allow me to be competent and good at work, and an employer would want to know that. And so we've started to see, and really we've been doing this in small pockets in higher education traditionally, right? We've for a long time tried to figure out, how do we give credit for prior learning? We've been working on that since after World War II, really, essentially. But we've not figured out how to do that at scale, and it's not gained wide scale appreciation. When someone comes out of the military, again, they've got lots of things that they're bringing to the table, and employers want to recognize that. And so now you see, again, education and credential providers trying to recognize that towards that person's credential. So what we start to see is, how are we doing that? How are educational and credential providers starting to recognize that learning? And so they're doing that by examining the competencies within that credential or within that learning program. And really, we envision a system of learning where, again, all that learning can be validated and valued regardless of where it happens. Because if it's high quality learning and someone can demonstrate that to you, that again is valuable to that person and to the employer. And we want to make sure that can contribute to them earning those credentials that they need over the long run, again, to see that mobility over time. The other thing that we, again, want to see over time is that those credentials should enable continued economic mobility for individuals and populations. And so we definitely want to see that I'm earning credentials that send me on an upward trajectory, that build up and stack up over time. What we don't want to see for learners is them gaining similar levels of skill sets over time, which mean I get to be a broad generalist maybe, but I don't have any deep skills that allow me, again, to start to progress upwardly. And so we have to kind of keep an eye as we're building all this and allowing learners to connect the dots between all of these different things, that they actually add up to something, again, that leads to economic mobility. In particular, again, trying to focus the system on solving for those who have been historically discriminated or segregated out from traditional systems, right? There's a reason that some of this learning hasn't been valued in the past. It's because we actually said, if you're this type of learner, you can't come to this type of institution, or you can't have this type of job previously. So we have a lot of things that we're trying to break down barriers around. And by doing this, though, again, we're starting to see an assets-based approach to individuals where they learned it and help them use that to get on their way to their credential. This just shows, again, the upward trajectory piece, right? Again, as we want to make sure that people can showcase their competencies and that they can use those to get access to greater employment and upward mobility. And certainly use cases of this is thinking about those multiple systems that now have to work together in order to be able to do that. Again, you saw the traditional higher ed system, those providers, the workforce system, the military. Folks are trying to move through all of those to keep on their upward trajectory. So, if I'm trying to move from high school to college, I'm bringing competencies with me to that college, and I don't want to retake things. I want to be able to get on my path and stay on my path. And so when we look at the competencies as they're coming in, I can ease that transition and make sure that we're meeting the learner, again, right where they're at. I can personalize that learning and get them on their path in the most efficient way to their credential. Similarly, with how we do 2-year and 4-year transfer. Right now, we are doing it by looking at the courses and seeing if the courses match up. But what we can actually do is, if we look at not the courses per se, but the competencies that somebody maybe got from those courses, we don't have to agree on the course number anymore. We can actually just say, these competencies came in, and give them credit, and again, move them on from their 2-year degree into their 4-year degree, and not, again, lose time or money in that process. Certainly the same is happening in a non-credit to credit space. So a lot of, if we're thinking about economic mobility and folks right now who, that 40 million that were maybe on unemployment, they needed a short form of learning to get right back into the labor market, right? They've got to put food on the table. But that does not mean that they didn't want to stop. They don't want to stop there. They don't want to stop moving up on this ladder. they want to keep doing that. And so now we're seeing colleges use competencies to do non-credit to credit transitions. So what we're going to do is say, yes, come in for that short form credential. We're going to get you that, at least a pay increase so that you can get back into the labor market. But we're going to get you to that associate's degree, or we're going to get you, maybe you came into the 4-year through continuing education, and we're going to apply all that learning using competencies into your degree. And again, keep you on this upward trajectory as you move. Same for the military. Again, bringing in lots of competencies and skills and being able to look at their joint service transcript, but also their military occupations to say, what were you actually doing while you were in the military? And again, we want to give you credit for that in the civilian world and make sure we keep you, again, moving forward and not set you back. Again, these are not things that are maybe too novel, but the way that we've been doing them have been without competencies. And so there's a lot of inefficiencies in the system, but we've also not been able to scale this. So as we think about those use cases I just gave you, those tend to happen on a very kind of one-off basis. So I have to, as a learner, I have to go into this institution. I have to ask them to look at what I'm bringing. And then hopefully somebody looks at it and sees value in it as well. There's nothing about that that is systematized. And so what we, again, see a movement towards is using competencies to systematize that and really start to bring this to scale. Again, given that we've got millions of people who we're trying to serve and provide that to. So this is what we call the power of competency-based learning, that when we are working in competencies, not seat time, not course buckets, not course numbers, not grades. When we use competencies, we can actually unlock learning. We can make sure it is recognized, and we can make sure it's valuable to the employer, right? So all of those things mean we have a much more flexible, responsive and valuable system for the people we're trying to serve and the employers that they're trying to connect to. So what is CBE, just if you've not heard of it before, is that competency-based education is focused on, again, actual student learning. And not just from a knowledge perspective, we believe that all learning, has to start with a knowledge base, but it also means that you are actively applying that learning. And we want to get as realistic about that application as possible. So rather than spend time in a classroom or on material, we're really starting to understand, can learners progress based on when they demonstrate. So that could be, maybe you come in and you demonstrate quickly that you've learned that, and you can move through that on your own pace and your own timing. Or maybe you want to come in and say, I only want to focus on one competency module at this moment because I've got a really busy workload for the next 6 weeks. So I'm only going to focus on this one competency for the 6 weeks. And then when my time frees up after that 6 weeks, I'm going to tackle 3 competency modules. So what we hear from learners all the time is they say, I set the calendar, I set the schedule. And as soon as I've mastered that, I know, and I have more confidence in my skill set. So I am, feel much better as a master of that. And we hear from employers, they really like this type of learning because, again, it's very clear what someone knows and can do, and that learner is better able to articulate it. And so this is kind of, again, what competency-based learning is again, getting out of the kind of traditional mindset of you go to this course, you listen to a lecture, and then you maybe take a test. This is really flipping the model off of time and onto actual learning. So what is a competency? I like to say this because there's lots of words being thrown around at this moment: skills, competencies, learning outcomes. And so I just like to be clear about what we mean. And there's a difference actually between all of these. And you'll see skills is embedded in the definition of competency, is that what does someone know? What do they need to know? What do I need to be able to do with that knowledge? What are the intellectual behaviors that I must display while I'm doing that? And then thinking about what is the context in which I must apply that knowledge and do that work. That's really important. Again, as you can think about with employers, is they want to know that when they hire you, you can, again, show up and do the job they've hired you to do. And so as much as we partner very closely with employers to understand that application and that transfer, and also define in the skill set. So again, a competency embodies all of this. A skill set is, again, what I need to be able to do. So it gets very task oriented. So it might look like a work task. Again, very important to be able to understand. And employers might say, this is what I want somebody to do on the job. But as an educator, then I've got to backtrack and say, okay, well, what do I need that person to know to be able to do that? How do I actually teach them how to do that? And then how do I teach them how to apply that in the right way? And so that's why competency becomes really important as a distinction between what is a skill, what is a competency, and what we mean by competency. But again, this becomes important because what we're trying to connect over in our system is not necessarily what I did for this employer over here, but what I want to know is, again, the full range of competency that a person has, because the setting could be different in which I might apply that, or this how I might take that knowledge and do something with it. It will vary from employer to employer. And so we want to use competencies as this currency. And so again, what we see is when we use competencies, we can connect, compare, and validate learning across any context, regardless where it came from, and be able to have that shared competency language. I'm seeing there's good questions in the chat, so thank you for posting those in there. I'll get to them. And so again, we really want to see competencies be the currency of our learning system, and allow us to, again, bridge this over time, build that lifelong learning over time, and connect people and learning across systems in the way that we need them to. So I like to say, again, if you're a higher ed person, which I am more oriented towards, I know we probably have K-12 people on here as well, but you're trying to, in all of our learning systems, people are trying to figure this out, right? How do I give credit for what somebody already knows and can do? I can meet learners where they're at. I can have a better understanding of everything they're bringing with them if it's in a competency format and written in that way. I can build stackable credentials. So I could maybe say in high school, a learner is going to get, this particular industry certification, and then I can stack that into their associate's degree. I can, again, do that non-credit to credit work. I can think about, again, personalizing learning, meaning, again, I'm going to only make you take what you don't have yet. I'm not going to make you sit through a course where you already know half the content and material. I'm going to get you right on your pathway. And then as we think about hiring, again, it's much clearer to employers how we're trying to connect that learning and what that means to them and in their system. And then on the right side, it really important for our Territorium colleagues and some of you who may be using is that all of this, the beauty of working in competencies and thinking about the new comprehensive learner record, is that I can then store those competencies in a digital format. I can share them with my next education provider. I can share them with my next employer, and I can share them in a standard data format by which they can be used. It also then allows us to do new things with that data. So part of the scale problem to credit for prior learning, or again, understanding what someone's bringing with them, is that we're often doing that by hand. When we have the data in a comprehensive learner record, now we in the way that it's structured and the way that the competency data is structured, I can now automate a review of that. So for instance, there's a company called MaxGrad that will come in and take that record and take the competencies that someone's brought with them and run that against the program, all the programs at the institution to say, which one of these are the most viable, are you most likely to get through the fastest because you've already learned the majority of it? Or just being transparent with the learner and saying, you've learned 30% of this program already, which is still great, right? But again, being able to really meet them where they're at, we can do new things that allow us to scale and serve every learner and automate some of these processes due to the comprehensive learner record and the work that's being done there to have the competency stored in a digital format, and again, in a standard that can be open, accessible, and read by any provider. So now I am going to get to this gets to the technology part. So what I get really excited about with the technology part is, again, we now have more transparency of those credentials and competencies. We can automate those competency audits. The learner can take, right, if we're trying to pull up their learning from everywhere, the learner can now be a part of that, and take their learning with them wherever they go. They could, because of self-sovereign identity and data management flows, that also allows them to access it at any time and really manage and share. So they don't have to go to an institution and say, can I have my transcript? Can I, or go to an employer and say, can you verify this? They've already got access to that verified information, which accelerates their ability to apply for jobs and get right back into the labor market. So just a couple of use cases I'll run through here to further demonstrate this is thinking again about that credit for prior learning and putting a face on what this can look like. So this is Jane. Jane is currently serving in the U.S. Army. She's an information technology specialist. She's an E5 sergeant, so pretty awesome work, right? She's done a lot of work to get to that E5 rank, and she enlisted, immediately after high school. So she's getting ready, today to discharge after 5 years of service. Like most military service members, she took some college courses from two different institutions. So, if you're in the military, you are often, stationed at different places over time. So when you don't have a very flexible learning model, that means that, if you have to get up and go, you're moving to the next, maybe you're moving across the country and now you're rolling in the next university. So, Jane's got courses from two different campuses. She's got, again, her job specialty training that the military has provided. And she knows she's, again, got a lot of things, and she's interested in cybersecurity in her civilian world, but doesn't know what the credential would be. How do I apply my military-based learning towards that credential? But looking at, again, if we're working with the Department of Defense and folks to make sure Jane has not just a joint services transcript, but truly a comprehensive record that allows her to enter the civilian space with those competencies and show up to an education provider. And again, for us to understand what she's already has, what she already knows, and get her onto her credential pathway in cybersecurity so that there's no question. Again, currently this is a very clunky process. And a lot of times we don't have a way to tell Jane where she could go. And so by moving and having this technology in place, we can now put that right in front of Jane and say, guess what? You have, 18 credits waiting for you in a cybersecurity program at X university. As you transition out, let's get you right to work and get you right into this program. Again, this is something we have not been able to do up until recently and are starting to scale. So again, a great use case for what happens when we use competencies across these military to higher ed sector. And again, that gets enabled by the new learner records. Again, it changes the world for Jane. And then I also want to introduce you to Alex, who is moving from that non-credit to credit space. So Alex held hourly wage jobs, hard labor jobs for most of his life after high school, but decided he wanted a new career. So he went to Perscolis, who got him in a program. He received a CompTIA A+ and Network Plus certifications, which are great. So got him a new job as a desktop analyst for a construction company. But now he knows he wants to go into management. So he's got to go back for a bachelor's degree. Again, he's already worked quite a bit. He's got skills and things that he knows. He's got new technology skills through those certifications. And so now he's trying to figure out, how do I leverage that, that learning I got while working, that learning that I got from Perscolis, and now I need to leverage that again into a degree. So how do I do that? Well, again, if I've got competencies, that allows us to know, what does Alex already have? What does he already know? What can he already do? And we want to get him into that management role. My guess is we could give him some credit for some project management skills or other things that might go into some of that college degree. But again, because this is transparent, those competencies are transparent. When he has a digital record, it's much easier to, again, get him on that pathway, present him with the information, and help him go through those choices and find his next piece of work. So, those are just, again, some use cases there that demonstrate what's possible when, again, all of us are working in competencies And again, using these new technologies to create that mobility. As you can see, both for Jane and for Alex, it was about them on a continuous upward mobility track. And again, we have to work hard to do that because we have shorter form learning that needs to happen. Again, folks needing to navigate their learning differently because they're working full time, or again, maybe they went to the military first. There's a lot of opportunity for us to unlock that mobility, because currently these folks are stuck. There is not an upward trajectory unless we create it in this way. And so that's what makes me most excited about, being here with you all today and talking about how competencies across these systems can work. So that is a quick overview of things. And I know we've got some Q&A, Kiko, I think.
Yes, we're going to get into that in a second. Absolutely. Yeah. So do you want to stop sharing? We can actually probably put your face in like big there. There you go. Awesomeness. All right. Yeah. So yes, we do have some questions, and eventually I will ask you a couple of them too before we finish. But the first two were from Dr. Janio here. The first one is, how are the less traditional ways to learn impact enrollment in brick and mortar institutions? What are the lessons for the current system of higher education?
Yeah, that's a great question. And hello, friend, Dr. Janio. I do think there are lessons here for the current system. And one is that just recognizing that while the current system provides a lot of learning, it's not the only place where learning happens. That can feel like giving up some power, right? That the traditional ways that we've forced people to learn, or again, not allowed people to learn. I think that's the lesson here, at least in the, certainly, again, over time and historically, certain people weren't allowed to go to post-secondary learning in this country. And so now we are trying to revamp that system to work for everybody, but also recognizing that there are lots of valuable places at the end of the day. And I think once higher ed recognizes that, again, it's not the only player, but it's an important player. And that it's got to be part of an ecosystem if it's going to do its job for people, that it has to be able, even in our traditional model, right? They're supposed to be taking people from high school and putting them into programs that work for them. That has to happen in addition to all of these adults and all these other folks who need to access it over time. One of the places that did some work around this is Stanford Design School did their Stanford 2025 project. And they talked about looped learning, that Stanford, of all places, would need to be recognized itself as a lifelong learning place, and that people would be looping in and out of higher education and bringing new skill sets in and having an opportunity to contribute and add on to what people had. So I think that folks are waking up, but again, it's realizing that, people have things, right? They have lots of learning they bring with them, and that you are but one player in this ecosystem that has a really important role to play if we're about mobility.
Well, then we have a second question from Dr. Janio, who is about accountability. Oh, the word. So it came out. Good for you, Dr. Janio. But he's basically saying accountability in traditional higher ed is based on other things, right? Yeah. Enrollment and persistence and nothing that you are not aware of, Amber. So, yeah. So how can learning generate apportionment, and how can learning be measured for the benefit of institutional accountability? Yeah.
So I'm going to back up and kind of go back to all those different learning providers. In addition to, so we've got higher ed as a system, right, is funded by state and federal governments, and systems of accountability have traditionally, like you said, been focused on enrollment, persistence, and graduation rates. I would say the same argument happens in our workforce system, where we're asking, we don't even ask who completed, we just say how many people completed a credential. And in our, there's lots of different ways that we fund education and training. And again, lots of different ways we hold those education and training providers accountable. In many ways, we're, again, not focusing, those quality assurance systems are focused on the inputs that go into the learning, not necessarily the outcomes that these systems produce. So I do think we have several experiments in each of these sectors. We have some new quality assurance entities. So, some of our regional and national accreditors are looking a little bit differently at how do we think about quality assurance for Title IV funding for federal aid differently if we're focused on student outcomes. You're also seeing states move this direction because, they traditionally would fund, higher ed institutions, again, based on enrollment. Did you get somebody to enroll? Now you see outcomes-based funding models where they're paying for graduation rates and even starting to look at employability, right? So not just did they graduate, but were they able to find a job? And that really gets you to, how do I find a job? Well, I've got to have competencies and skills. So it starts to lead you to that. One of the most interesting quality assurance models in the country, I think, is with the Texas State Technical College System. And I don't just say that because I'm a native Texan, but I say that because their entire funding for those colleges is based on their ability for students to get jobs. So they don't get money. They don't have enrollment, persistent graduation. It is strictly based on, did you get students in, did they graduate, and did they get a job? If you can't prove that they didn't get it, that they got a job, you don't get funding from the state. That's pretty, that blows a lot of people's minds, but that is a system that has worked, right? They are able to, they're doing it. They work within that. They work close with employers. They make sure that what they're offering leads to employability, and not just any job, but a family sustaining wage. Again, they're really focused on employment up that economic mobility route. So, yes, lots of work to do on our quality assurance systems.
So the funding is always kind of an interesting conversation to have, isn't it?
The funding is, and that's been our carrot and stick, right? Of how we've tried to move these things over time. Yeah.
Well, we have another question, which is more around the personal stories that you shared, right? Monica said that she loves them. But what about more traditional high school graduates who go to schools where they can graduate by competencies? Interesting.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. I was just on the phone this morning with some colleagues in the K-12 space. This is a growing movement in K-12 and very exciting to see, traditional high school graduates who come out with a record that is competency-based. And I will say there's a lot of parents who have been leery of this, though. They're saying, oh my gosh, if my student went by competencies, are they going to be able to get into college? Are they going to be able to do all these things? And, we have helped higher education communicate, like, actually, that's much better information for me to come into an admissions conversation with, right? If I'm an admissions officer right now, I'm using imperfect things to determine who we let into our program, versus in a competency-based model, it's like, oh, your student demonstrated that they could do all of these things. I don't need a standardized test. I don't need, this or that, because I have right here in front of me what they actually did to show they're college ready. And so you see that is absolutely a thread that's happening. There was a report this morning that came out from KnowledgeWorks. I think it was something like there's over 200 bills in state legislators to move and shift K-12 education to competency-based learning. So I think this will be a trend, again, that we see across all these sectors, is everyone's trying to, again, provide that mobility and do their part. They're leaning into competency-based learning pretty significantly.
That's great. Well, the next one is more about standards and standard setting. And again, one of those incredible topics about taxonomies of competencies, ontologies, all that. So go for it, Amber.
Yeah. Oh, this is such a fascinating thing here in the US. So, in most countries, they have qualifications frameworks. They've had qualifications frameworks for years, which tried to set some kind of standard competency language of which people could align to, and we could translate between learning providers or create pathways between systems. We don't have that here because everybody likes to do their own thing. So I think at one point, Credential Engine kind of calculated there were over 1,000 taxonomies or competency frameworks in the US that are at use, which is part of our problem. Is we've got all these things going around. So, part of the work that I led at Lumina that Kiko is familiar with, and then I think I saw Holly Zanville on here too, is, we were leading work to see, like, could we adopt a common framework? Like, would people, employers, and education providers adopt a common qualifications framework on our own without top-down management from a government? And what we learned was no. People like to use the frameworks, but they didn't want to, like, no, I still like my language. So I kind of shifted the tone, and this is about the time that technology was coming, helping us, and we could see, you saw the Pandora do the music genome project, right? You could see all this, like, oh, well, if we are able to have everybody at least publish their competency statements in a common standard, like you're pointing to, then we can start to have AI read between those, do the matches, and tell us, and treat it kind of like language translation. So your competency language may look like French, and my competency language might look like Italian. And, Kiko's got, Spanish. So, like, how do we start to let the AI just do the translation so nobody has to get off of their piece? But that means there's a lot of work to be done here. There are folks who are building those standards. There's been a lot of work done through the T3 Innovation Network on doing this work with competencies. There's private companies doing that, but I've long been an advocate, along with Territorium, in open standards, because just because you figure that out in a closed system doesn't mean that's going to work for that learner when they go to the next job or the next education opportunity. We have to have an open system and open standards so that we can connect these competencies up and start to, again, get to a more common language over time. I could see us getting to that, but we're probably 5 or so years from that place, maybe.
Being optimistic. All right,
yeah.
for the sake of timing, we have like around 15, 14 minutes, 3 more questions. If people want to ask more questions, please do so in the Q&A little bubble. Bill was asking, how and where are you seeing employers, especially small and medium employers, engaging, evaluating, and consuming non-degree credentials?
Yeah. Hi, Bill. Great question. And there was actually a research study that came out from SHRM, the Society of Human Resource Management folks, on this topic. In particular, that I think, credentials are still very confusing. I would say not just non-degree credentials, but credentials are confusing, mainly because, again, we don't have a standard way to understand what they are, what they mean. Even degrees, there could be thousands of iterations of I have a bachelor's in psychology. What's actually in that can mean, as many institutions of higher education as we have, 4,000 meanings of that in the US, right? Because each campus has a different way that they do that program. I do think some of the non-degree credentials, like the industry credentials, folks get excited about because there's a national standard behind those and the assessment is the same. And so sometimes employers lean on those, particularly in fields like technology, manufacturing, nursing, where they've highly professionalized and understand those pathways and those credentials. But as far as new ones being developed, my caution to education providers, especially institutions that are building micro-credentials, is you need to work very closely with your employer community to build those so that they understand and have helped you define what those are, what the competencies need to be in those. Because if you create them on your own, what we have is, again, a learner shows up and the employer's like, I have no clue what this is. I don't know if it's valid. And I don't care who provided it. I have no idea how to read what this means for me. So it is something we have to do a lot of work with with employers. So, don't ever, in general, a practice is like, don't develop an educational program without your employers at the table, or else you're going to build, even if they recognize the credential name, those competencies may not be what they need, and you've got to be that granular with them.
And Bill also asked you, for learners that learn in multiple institutions, what is the best identifier? I don't know what that exactly means, but to use to help those students place multiple experiences from multiple providers, I guess learning providers, on a CLR.
Oh, yeah. So I know enough to be a little bit dangerous here, and there's probably some more technological folks.
I could answer that one, but I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, the digital identifier. So I do think this is where the work around digital wallets is really starting to take off, Bill. For instance, there's 10 states that are working on providing those so that individuals would have a way to have multiple records, again, accumulated over time. If we're doing this right, I'm going to have multiple records accumulated over time and have competencies from a lot of different places. So there's work to think about how we do this, also how we do this at scale when we've got lots of different record issuers, lots of different wallet issuers, kind of like your driver's license. Again, we're seeing states start to provide this for their citizens, but what if I move from that state to the next state? I need to be able to take my records with me. So there's a lot of work underway in this area. Kiko, I'm wondering what you might add to that I've missed.
No, I'm telling you, been there, done that. I had like many driver's licenses when I moved, and that was the number one issue for me was when are we going to have a system that recognizes things across? That's the whole idea of connecting the dots. And honestly, I work for one vendor, but my hope is that all vendors understand that for the learner, it's important to be technology agnostic or record agnostic. I want to be able to move, period. Help me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And something that I saw, I won't take credit for because it was, Blue Sky, which has been Kim Hunter Duffy, who's been working on this stuff for a long time, is just saying, we need to focus less on building platforms, more on building protocols, because that's, not that we don't need platforms, but again, it's less about closed platforms, more about protocols that allow people to take their data and information with them wherever they need.
So I have two more questions that actually, and Rebecca also asked one in the chat, and they are more or less about the same. Is about the competency-based evaluation on one side. Dr. Sylvester was asking, should be seriously evaluated due to very often, evaluators' lack of basic knowledge and skills in the subject matter. So that's the one thing, right? To some evaluators, the entire process of competency evaluation is an admin exercise, right? Rebecca was asking also something connected to that, which is, what are the best ways to encourage faculty to be part of that? And then the last one is, how do you educate employers to understand competency-based? So it's like, now we're talking about all the individuals involved in this, from the education side and from the employer side. So if you have a magic answer, I think that we will all sign on that one.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing that I think we have here is, for a long time, again, we did not design education with employers. And I think we now see that shifting, that we can't build, pathways of learning that don't lead somewhere, and that we've got to be in touch with our employers. Now, we've tried to do that a variety of ways, and I think we've all agreed we've kind of failed. No one wants to do an employer advisory group. The employers don't, the education institution doesn't. And so we've actually started to see some different ways again for folks to use their employer relationships. So I'm going to use Texas A&M Commerce as one. They have transition given, there's COVID-19. We've also had issues around racial reckoning within policing. And so they were like, we need to tackle this. We're working with our local police forces that want to diversify their staffs and are working hard to do that. But we also need to revise our curriculum, and we're going to provide it in a competency-based way. So they sat down with those police departments and fully outlined what are the competencies and skill sets that have to be part of that job. How do we design the curriculum in a way that is relevant, right? That is real life. And so we're going to teach them, again, the knowledge base, but they have to be able to go and apply that. They have to apply that across many different contexts. And so how do we design real world assessments? And as they got into the assessment question, they actually had employers and faculty working together to do the assessment together. Because to get to the question about how do you think about that, that was very informative, because you could see how the different contexts played out. And what it did for the learner was they felt like not just that they had mastered, but but they knew the employer knew that they had mastered. And again, they had a lot more confidence going into that. So while it felt like it can feel like an administrative burden and exercise, because they had done every stage of the work together, the institution and the employer community was very much in sync the whole way. Again, from competency set decision to the curriculum, what it looks like, how it's taught, who's teaching it, who does assessment, so that it went, when those learners showed up for jobs, that employer was like, we know this. We helped design this program. We helped assess this learning. I saw you, Sally, at the program, right? It just smoothed that over in a way that I think is ideal for both the employer and the institution, because they both win, right? And at the end of the day, when they both win, actually the learners win, our society wins, because they're diversifying their workforce. We're changing policing. We're actually getting to mobility for those folks who had been locked out of the system before. So it is a lot of, I'm not going to say it's not a lot of work, and it is a lot of working differently than we traditionally have been in higher ed. But when you see the outcome, while this is hard work, we hear people say all the time, this is the work we have to do, and our learners deserve it. So yeah, that would be my advice on that part.
That is awesome. And with that, I think we're going to close, because I was going to tell you, if there is a pearl of wisdom to conclude this conversation, which is obviously not concluding, it's just starting or continuing, but what will you tell people, and where does the hope reside?
Yeah. For me right now, the hope resides in the fact that one, you all showed up today, that there were people willing to just think differently about what we do, how we do it, and recognize that the system we have is broken. And for a long time, folks have been sounding the alarm and saying it's broken and saying it's broken. And but what we're starting to see is an uptick in activity, an uptick in the desire for change. And an uptick in that innovation at a systems level. So when we first started with CBEN about 5 years ago, it was individual institutions that were coming to us saying like, oh, I need to do this. Now we have entire state systems. Now, again, we have folks saying we've got to collectively move this way. We have employers saying that. So I remain hopeful that we will get there, because we have more people joining the party and more people wanting to make this systemic. And so all that to say, don't give up, keep pushing hard, and keep thinking of new ways to do this. These are still young initiatives, and we need everybody here iterating on it as quickly as possible, again, so we can make it better for people.
And I think on behalf of all the audience and my colleagues and myself, thank you, Amber. You have been a terrific, I knew it. I knew that the mom of CLR would not disappoint me at all. I have to say, I'm super proud of you personally as a friend. I knew that you were going to do a lot of good to this field. And I feel like it's also people like you that can make a huge difference. So thank you on behalf of everybody. And then, next June 16th, there's another webinar with Holly Sandville, which probably a lot of people know. We'll send you more information about that. But for now, Amber, thank you. And everybody, thanks for attending. Talk soon.